Hello, and welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet, made possible by the CNA Foundation, the H&M Foundation, the Relander Foundation, and Tencel. This is done in collaboration with Eco Textile News and Planet Textiles. I am Mike Schragger. So today I want to talk about chemistry and chemicals. Sexy, right?
For some of us.
Very sexy. So as a reminder, for the basic people out there like me who need to understand, chemistry, right, is the study and practice of how substances combine and how they interact with energy, right? That's the very basics. So it's everywhere. Chemistry and chemicals are used, of course, in our industry, the apparel and textiles industry. And in some circles, the idea of chemicals and harmful chemicals have become also a major agenda item for our industry. How chemicals like pesticides, like the ones used to create the dyes and the dyestuffs, are negatively affecting people, the planet. And so, of course, we need to look at that and see what the current status of play is around this area of chemical management. So lucky enough, I have two of my favorite people who happen to be in the same place at the same time with me here, who are experts in this and have lots of opinions. Linda Greer is a returning guest to this lovely pod. Linda, for 20 years or so, worked at the NRDC and now is doing a range of things, including maybe you need to say, are you a fellow?
I'm a global fellow for the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, which is a Chinese environmental NGO.
Okay, a global fellow. I bet you can't beat that, Phil.
No, I can't.
Well, it's called global because I'm actually not living in China. So it's sort of for not
so
such
anyone
an...
outside of China is global. Okay. And Phil, you are my global fellow, but what exactly? Phil, of course, I've known for a very long time as well. Spent 10 years at Marks and Spencer's before starting his own expert consultancy called Color Connections.
Yep.
Yeah, you've been doing that for how long now?
11 years.
11 years. Okay. So let's start out like this. I just want you to answer true, false, or not sure to these statements so we get a sense. So the apparel and textile industry uses a significant amount of harmful chemicals.
True.
True.
The seriousness of the problem is, however, overblown.
False.
Some of that's true, some of that's overblown.
Chemical companies are part of the problem.
True.
Somewhere between true and
Okay. There have been significant improvements to address these challenges in chemical management during the last 25 years.
True.
True.
There are good solutions today.
True.
Wow, that was better than I thought. All right.
True to
So let's start out by giving just a 10-minute introduction to this area for those who are new to it. Can you both, from your own perspectives, just remind us when and how chemicals are used in apparel and textiles in our industry? Just the basics.
Okay, I'll kick off. They're used from start to finish. So they are used in agriculture for growing fibres. They're used in the chemical industry for making synthetic fibres. They are used as processing aids in weaving, in knitting, in spinning. They are used in large quantities in wet processing, and they are used by the consumer to do home laundry. However, where they are used and where they come off the textiles and go to the environment are different. So they're used throughout the chain, but the main areas in wet processing where they are removed and go down the drain. So that is the key area to...
And wet processing, you mean when the fabrics...
Where the fibres, yarns, fabrics are scoured, bleached, dyed, where chemical finishes are applied to give a particular performance parameter.
Okay. So how harmful are the chemicals that are used, though? You know,
there's no single measure of harmfulness. So there are a basket of parameters. So you've got carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, tetragenicity. You've got
what's that?
Well, these are things where they can affect your cells and cause them to mutate or change. There's endocrine disruptors, there's toxicity. So people like to talk about toxic this and carcinogenic that. And a lot of the chemicals have those properties, or historically they've had those properties. But there's also things like, can they burn you? Can they cause skin irritation? For things that are important for workers. But then also, one part of the conversation which often gets missed out are harmless chemicals that are very harmful for the environment. So things like starch that is used in weaving, salt that is used in dyeing. These are things that we eat on a daily basis. But if they go into a river, they can cause enormous damage.
Right.
So the thing that we always have to keep on the agenda is the fact that harmless chemicals can be very, very harmful, and not just talk about toxics and carcinogens.
And they can be harmful because in vast amounts they become problematic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So when you hear textile dyers saying we're doing dyeing without salt,
Yep.
right? Or we're doing a new denim process that doesn't need starch, or the starch is more for
weaving.
For
Yeah.
weaving, exactly. Okay.
And the starch, as a matter of fact, is sort of food for the wastewater treatment plant. So done correctly, starch isn't a problem. But if you discharge too much of it, what it does is it depletes the oxygen in the river. So it is a little bit subtle, the sorts of impacts that some of these chemicals can have on the ecosystem, which can be different than the impacts that they have on human health.
Okay.
And that's a key part that Linda mentioned there, effluent treatment plants.
Yeah.
There is part of the industry that has effluent treatment plants, and there's part of the industry that discharges directly to rivers, lakes, etc. And then the part of the industry that's got effluent treatment plants, some of them run them very well and remediate effluent really well,
Yeah.
and some don't.
Okay.
I guess one thing that I would add to that is just that you have to really look at where manufacturing occurs around the world nowadays. So back in the day, let's say 1980s, even into the early 1990s, a lot of the effluent treatment plants were, and manufacturing was occurring in Western Europe or in America, where there was a very mature environmental regulatory system. Everyone had permits. They pretty much knew what they had to do in order to stay on the right side of the law. But as globalization occurred and as some of these manufacturing facilities went abroad, they've wound up in places where the governments lack either the technological capacity or political will to really keep on top of them. And so we have a little bit of a perfect storm there, an industry that uses a lot of chemicals, that discharges a lot of the chemicals that they use in places that aren't really ready for prime time. And that is, I think, a thumbnail sketch of why the industry is so dangerous to human health and the environment, is because some of the areas that they're located in can't really keep on top of curtailing the inherent hazard of the chemicals that they use.
But how big is this problem? How serious is this problem when it comes on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being not the problem, 10 being a big problem.
Well, I think you've got 3 aspects with chemicals. You've got worker safety,
Okay.
you've got consumer safety, and then you've got environment. And with the environment, it's not just a few trees and a few fish, it is the people that live in the environment. And what you have is, overall, the management of these toxic chemicals and carcinogens and nasty chemicals, that's improving. That is definitely an improving picture. The remediation of textile effluents with conventional parameters, so that you're not putting water in there, the sort of effluent in there that depletes oxygen or affects the temperature, affects the levels of solids and salts, etc. That's slowly improving, but it's still nowhere near as good as it was in the 1980s when the industry was largely based in Europe. And
So you're talking about where it's based now. It's getting better, but it's still quite bad in relation to where it was in Europe.
Yeah. And that's, it's frustrating to someone like me, who is an environmental professional, that that a lot of these brands know how to do this, and they know what it's supposed to look like. They themselves personally were overseeing this industry operating at a much more advanced level more than 20 years ago. So it's frustrating to watch modern day manufacturing look like old-fashioned manufacturing that had occurred in my country, in America, before the passage of the Clean Water Act in the 1970s. So it's frustrating that as we move forward with so-called progress, we see sort of a really significant backsliding based on just the countries where the industry has moved.
But the chemical inputs
Yes.
are improving.
The chemical
Yes.
inputs.
The chemical inputs are improving.
Right.
So
It's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah. So when you said to start with, are the chemical companies part of the problem?
Yeah.
Yes, they are, because they produce the chemicals that are used. But they're also part of the solution.
Yeah.
And to be fair, the better chemical companies have improved significantly over the last 20 years. But the overall picture, it's one of those things where it's quite frightening, really, that I can go into a factory in a developing country where things are being produced and go in with my package of information that I learned in the early 90s when I first started work and be a hero.
Yeah.
Now, can you imagine that in something like telecommunications?
If we've moved a lot of the production to countries who don't have the infrastructure or the technology or the political motivation and regulation to manage this well, as we did, as you say, many years ago in Europe, does that mean that the environmental impacts, the consumer impacts, the workers' impacts are mainly localized in that part of the world where they're not managing it well? Or does everyone who experiences and buys textiles experience the problem?
Well, the pollution tends to be localized.
Oh.
So if effluents are not remediated and they either go directly into a river or are not properly remediated and go into a river, the pollution effects are localized. But these things are interlinked, and part of the technology and part of the move forward is using energy and water efficiently. So again, the water consumption in the UK in 1990 was more efficient than the water use currently in developing nations where things are being produced. And the more water you use, the more chemicals you use, because it's normally on a gram per litre basis. The more water you use, the more energy you need to heat it up. So it contributes to climate change. So the amount of energy used to heat up these huge amounts of water, so it does affect people.
So I was going to ask, right? I was going to ask the link between chemical use, water, and energy.
Yeah.
Those have always been talked about as sort of a three-part group.
Yeah, but water's the key.
Water's the key.
Yeah.
Right. And then Phil's point that the water tends to be really hot.
Right.
And so that just means you're spending a lot of energy to heat it up. And just to double up on the point that he made, the less water you use, the less chemicals you use, the less energy you use. So the solutions can have a nice harmonic convergence there. You don't have to go, one is not pulling against the other. The only other point I'll make is I fully agree with Phil that the problems are largely local in terms of the impact, with the exception of pollutants that bioaccumulate. And so a pollutant that is persistent, that winds up in the food chain, that winds up in the fish, well, we have a global supply chain of fish. Our food supply is quite global. You look at, I did a lot of work on mercury for a long time, which is not really a hugely important chemical in the apparel sector, though there are some uses. But, the mercury winds up in tuna fish, and all of the tuna fish that we eat in America comes from the South China Sea. So some of it is a surprise in terms of impact, but most of it is, as Phil described, localized impacts, with that exception.
And we're not experiencing, I don't see a lot of news articles about chemicals washing off and irritating people's skin.
Right, mostly if it's off spec,
right,
then you would get that
I
problem.
would get that. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we can be complacent.
Okay.
And if you look on, for example, the RAPEX system, which is the European system where you get a weekly list of products that have been taken off the market for whatever reason. This can be cars, it can be electrical items. You can't be complacent. There are still textiles out there with harmful levels of dangerous or illegal chemicals present. But it's getting better. And what I would really summarise it as, the chemical inputs are getting better, but we can't be complacent. But the volumes we're consuming, the amounts of water we're using, the amounts of energy we're using to make them, means that as consumers, we've probably never been safer. As citizens, we've probably never been so unsafe. But people don't see that yet. They see a few more storms, they see a few more dry periods.
Okay. So in the big picture, we've been undermining the
and of course, then in the big picture, we're complicit in this problem. But I think people don't really realize that there's such a huge environmental footprint in the clothing that they buy.
Right.
It's not really very well understood. And then those consumers that are concerned often worry about maybe the wrong thing, which is, whether or not this sweater would contain harmful chemicals that would harm them. Their exposure as Western consumers to harmful chemicals comes from a lot of other sources first.
Right.
But what they don't realize is the big picture. That in the big picture of fast fashion, how much they're buying, et cetera, are leading to these global problems, which are enormous and are impossible to unwind. So that's where I think we would really like to point people, as they worry about the environmental impacts of this industry.
Okay. So let me ask, today's solutions when it comes to reducing harmful chemicals, we can look at both innovations, we can look at initiatives, private sector actors, right? Are they working? Are they so on one hand you're giving me a story that in the last bunch of years we've outsourced production as part of the whole story to low-income countries. In those countries there haven't been the infrastructure, the policies, the technique to manage what we did here. And then in response we have some initiatives. We have the Greenpeace going out and lifting chemicals again as a key issue for our industry. We have the response to that, the zero discharge of harmless chemicals as an initiative and now as a nonprofit NGO. We have Blue Sign, we have labeling, we have enzymes, right? We have organizations trying to somehow attack this challenge, right? So how would you say, are these developments, are they improving the situation?
I think if you've got to understand the history of the chemical industry and the textile industry, really to put things in context. There's a book called Morph, which is the history of William Perkin, who invented the first synthetic dye, and it's a difficult read because it's quite chemically. But Morph. Okay. Or mauve, depending on your pronunciation.
Which colour?
and it just tells you it was an absolute disaster 100 years ago. And one of the things that we got to be aware of in Europe and in America is that we went through our industrial revolutions with textiles, and it was awful, and we were really, really bad, and we polluted our rivers and we killed our children and we did all sorts of terrible things with chemicals. But the scale of it was tiny compared to the scale of it now with population growth and consumerism, and we don't want the other countries to go through the same horrors. Right. So where we are at the moment, we're still at the last stages, I think, and again, we can't be complacent, at the last stages of the making things better by avoiding the worst. We're still eliminating things that are bad, that have been normal and are bad. And we're just starting to see things that are good emerging. So we're a bit of a crossover point where we're starting to see some green chemistry coming in with things that are much, much safer with a better profile. But we're still really at the stage where we're trying to get rid of bad stuff.
Okay, so what are you optimistic about? So what do you think is working? What would you say, I want more of that?
I think biology over chemistry. So the enzymes are working. I think the chemistry...
What does an enzyme do?
So it does a lot of different things. They can use it for scouring, they can use it for polishing, they can use it for a lot of different things. And, it's done without chemicals, it's done at lower temperatures, it can be done with lower water. So I think that for me, and it's all readily available, so that we know how to do. So more like that is what I would say. I think just the general, less persistent chemicals and less inherently toxic chemicals. I think I agree with Phil that we are on that path of more discovery. I would say though the thing that is discouraging to me is that all of this is resting basically on voluntary industry initiatives at this point. Again, because of the forces of globalization, that they're not being required to do this by governments. I think the environmental community is in part complicit and I'll include ourselves, NRDC, for going along with the notion that the party best positioned to improve things was the private sector, given that had become such a global manufacturing world, et cetera, and I got to tell you, I'm done with this. I feel like the evidence is in that the companies are not prepared to move at the pace and at the depth that is required to get on top of this problem.
So it's good to know that you're consistent, Linda, because we did.
Was I done with it last year too? Yeah. I'm just completely done with it. I mean, whatever is done as I was last year, I'm more done.
You and I talked about, I said, well, when I look at my change theory, I don't see how you can rely on the private sector. Yeah. You need to go hard on them.
Yeah, and I have to say, when I was sitting there today listening to the presentations at Planet Textiles, honest to God, we could have heard some of that 4 years ago from the very same people. And what that tells me is that what more of the same is not going to get us where we need to go.
Right, okay. So you were optimistic about that there are some what we call biological-based solutions that allow you to do the same thing, but in a less harmful way. Phil, are there any things you're optimistic about? Because we'll move in a second to some more nuanced discussion.
I'm optimistic that some brands, a tiny number of brands, are starting to look very, very seriously at water and water consumption. And when you've got areas of the world where water is free to the factory, why would they save it?
Yeah.
So you've got some brands that are beginning to build it into their ways of working. What I'm also optimistic about is that recently I've seen zero liquid discharge, and this is a system whereby instead of a factory using water with chemicals for process, putting it through an effluent treatment plant and putting that into the river, remediated, they remediate the effluent and then they recycle all the water. So it reduces net water consumption by about 90%. Now, when I first looked at this maybe 15, 12, 10 years ago, it was very expensive, very energy intensive, but the technology's moved on to make it affordable with a lower energy footprint. And I think we're at a stage where we can start to see this becoming the norm. Now, as well as saving water, it will challenge people to use less energy. It will, by using less water, because they've got the cost of recycling it, they will automatically use fewer chemicals because they'll be using less water and the chemicals are carried in that water. But the other thing that does, it challenges the whole mentality of how we use chemicals at the moment. As an industry, if you are a wet processor or in the textile chain, you buy chemicals, you use them, you remediate what's not left on the product, and you dump it.
Right.
If dump is taken out of the equation, maybe we need to start thinking a little bit more about what can we use and reuse. Do we actually want things that are biodegradable? The consumers are sort of conditioning to thinking that natural is good, biodegradable is good. Biodegradation causes global warming. Mm. So is it better to biodegrade something and release methane or release carbon dioxide, or just use it again?
Okay, so you're looking at a nuanced perspective that these terminologies that we think are representing a better approach, in actuality, in practice, may be harmful or if used in the wrong way. But not only that, but it may mean that we want to use chemicals in a different way, but in a closed system.
Yeah. Right. But I think where you see, in certain areas of the world, in places like Tirupur region of India, they've mandated zero liquid discharge. And so there's no option. They do it. And because they've got to do it...
that's an interesting case. So when did they mandate that?
Maybe 10 years ago.
And has that made a big difference?
Yeah. There's still people that try and get around it and don't do it properly. Yeah. But it has made a big change.
Okay.
And initially they got a dyeing factory and a water recycling factory with similar input in terms of energy and similar cost. But it's changed now, so the water recycling, the zero liquid discharge, is becoming more and more cost effective. Right. And that's why I can see this working. I think morally, is it okay to take water from the earth, fill it with chemicals, partially treat it, and chuck those chemicals back into the environment? But when you've got something that is available, that works, and is starting to become cost effective,
right?
Yeah.
You've got to say, let's have a look at it. But then when you've got that model, this is where I say you may be able to then start looking at designing chemicals for reuse rather than remediation.
Yeah. And that's not common today.
No, and it's quite difficult.
It's quite difficult to do that. Okay.
Yeah, there's a little bit done in mercerizing.
Okay.
This is, I just think this is really a very interesting driver too, because, the reason why a government in India would say you have to have zero discharge is because they desperately need their water resources. Okay, so it's very immediate, it's visceral. It's not, this is a chemical that could cause cancer. It's not, this is climate change that could eventually affect you. It's just like we cannot go on without water. Right. So it's a very potent driver of environmental control. And, as Phil has described, it could then drive other things that would be, huge side benefits, so to speak, in terms of changing the amount and types of chemicals used, lower energy, et cetera. So it's a point of leverage that's really quite interesting. And really, as this industry has grown and grown and grown, and has grown in places it doesn't really belong, right, from the perspective that it's a very water-intensive industry, this really is a promising thing to keep your eye on, because you can see why governments would make it happen. In their immediate self-interest, as opposed to some of the other issues that we worry about.
Okay, so we're going to now dive a little bit more deeper into the nuances of some questions here. So for those of you who just wanted an overview, you've gotten it. You can, of course, contact these individuals, I'm sure, separately to ask more questions, right? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, they had to say yes. No, Michael. But now we're going to go in some sort of wonky, weedy kinds of questions.
We haven't been wonky already.
Well, I think we have, but
we're going to We're going wonky.
We're going to go wonky. So
game on is what I say. Game on.
Let's do it. So in all this, have you really explained what you think are the critical components to the solution for chemical use and pollution? You've mentioned them, but do you have a roadmap? Do you say these are the components that we're advocating for?
Yeah, I think you avoid the worst. So you put standards in place for effluent discharge, or for air emissions, or for chemicals on product. You put standards in place for chemical inputs. I mean, that's the first thing, to make sure you're not putting bad chemistry in. But then in terms of better chemistry, if you did have a zero discharge mandate globally or from brands, then that would change things dramatically in terms of pollution. But then you would have the change in chemistry possibly. One thing where I'm absolutely in agreement with Linda is that carrots are never as effective as sticks. I am a huge fan of sticks. So legislation is great in terms of making things happen. However, one area that is really, really challenging is the cost of bringing new chemistry to market. And the cost of bringing new chemistry to market and getting it through all the different legislative barriers and registrations and things is really, really expensive. So if you are a chemical company with an existing chemical and you're selling a zillion tons of it profitably, and then you make something that challenges it from a safety perspective or ease of recycling perspective or whatever that's better, it's a really difficult decision to bring it online and compete with yourself. And for the pleasure, you get charged hundreds of thousands of dollars through registration and things. So I think
so. The economics of innovation are not in our favor, the chemical industry's favor.
And if you've got governments that are committing to big targets, like in the UK, they've just made a big statement they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. If governments make a big statement that involves chemicals and all part of this story, I think they should almost waive registration rights. They should still have the systems in place.
Yeah.
They should still have the systems in place. But I think bringing new chemicals to market that give absolute benefits should be free, if not even pay people to do it.
Right. Okay.
And then there's sort of the other end of the spectrum to the end that Phil was just talking about. So if you just look at the low-hanging fruit, the opportunities to just reduce the amount of existing chemicals that are used. There's some chemicals that are sort of needlessly added. A little bit, people think a little bit more would be better. There's some that are carelessly over added, which don't, you don't need to be, you should be measuring, you shouldn't just throw it in. There's chemicals that are not manufactured well, so they're coming in with a lot of impurities, so they have, they're sort of dirty chemicals that need to be scrutinized, etc. So there are a lot of low-hanging fruit opportunities to reduce the use and go and improve things before you even get to the need for actually greener chemicals, the ones that are less inherently dangerous that Phil was just describing. So I would say there's a continuum and kind of a panoply of options open, many of which haven't really been given a run for the money yet, and those improvements would be very meaningful in the operations around the world right now.
Okay, so we have good
Kind of
ideas.
two ends.
Right, two ends, and we have good ideas, but we need to make an incentive so people start to implement these ideas, right? You, of course, mentioned legislation where you said in the beginning that in the countries where this is having the biggest impact, the legislative sort of infrastructure is not there. Maybe in certain places, like you mentioned in India, it is there with zero liquid discharge.
In certain areas. But legislation is always this thing that we all want, but know how hard it is to make it happen. What are these voluntary initiatives? ZDHC. Now,
so before we jump to voluntary initiatives, let me just add one thing on the legislative, because I'm very struck by what's going on in China right now with the government, which I will grant you is, I think, in large part because the government is quite desperate to get on top of its pollution problems because they've been very severe and the population of China is feeling upset about it. And so the government is responding basically to public pressure to do something about it. And this is where I think we do benefit from modern times. So we have pollution probes that can do real-time monitoring of pollution. We have the internet where things can be publicized widely and publicly available. And we have some drivers that actually I'm working with the Chinese NGO where I'm a fellow now, some drivers that can cause things to happen that is broader than just the government itself issuing edicts and regulations. And that is a benefit of the modern age. That is something we actually didn't have in the 1980s. So I think that some transparency leads to accountability on some of the operations of these factories. And that is another source of optimism in terms of holding feet to the fire for factories that might not otherwise be motivated to take care.
So are you talking about something specific, like there is a technique where we can see how much each factory is polluting?
So specifically right now in China, beyond the textile industry alone, there are 15,000 factories that do real-time monitoring of their effluent and air pollution stat gas, and that real-time monitoring is publicly available.
And how is that?
So,
how is that? What's the incentive for them to do that?
They're required to do it.
They're required,
and they're doing it. Not all of them, of course, but many of them are doing it. And they are sometimes cheating, but a lot of times they're not. And so there's a big bucket of data, actually.
Is that data that people outside of China can get access to?
Anyone can have access to it.
Okay.
So it's a funny thing because China's not really known as the land of open information. But in this case, again, because they're taking advantage of modern day technology to try to get on top of a problem that they really care about, I think it is a point of optimism and a point of innovation that's really making a difference. Certainly something that other countries could pick up and run with.
Okay.
And so before we got to, I didn't want to go back to the dark side, which I'm about to go to with your voluntary initiatives, before I mention that I'm really upbeat about that. And I think it's really interesting and valuable information.
So if we have access to that information, we're assuming it's going to stay available. Certain actors within China can use that to see who's the worst polluters and to go after them.
Right.
How do people outside of China use that information?
So anyone can use this information as long as they know the name of the factory in Chinese.
Okay.
And that's a complication. Don't underestimate that complication. But once you have the name in Chinese, you can access the database at the organization IPE. It's a free open access database.
Okay.
And then you can be like Linda Greer and use Google Translate to see what it says. And you can actually kind of figure out what the violations are. Brands are using it.
Yeah.
Local citizens are using it when they have a problem.
Yeah.
They're also taking pictures of things and geolocating them and sending them in so that people can see what that looks like. And it is sort of radical transparency on industrial operations that I think really is exciting in terms of what it offers for basic accountability.
Okay. So that you would consider a very innovative area.
Yeah.
Okay. Which should be applied not only to chemical pollution, but to water discharge to greenhouse gases.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Could also.
Okay.
Just wanted to.
All right. So Phil, we were told we're moving into the dark side. Are you ready for the dark side? I don't know if you feel similarly, but so in this whole world, in this bubble sometimes of sustainability and textiles, we have a number of actors. We've seen from the Greenpeace campaign, they really motivated the development of the zero discharge, the roadmap to zero discharge of harmful chemicals, which evolved into first a sort of initiative, then a nonprofit NGO, right? And now that particular NGO is making a inroads into taking a lot of space in the conversation, at least here in Europe and North America, right, about what this industry should be doing around harmful chemicals. I'm curious on your view on this initiative now that it's been around a few years. It's being promoted. Today there was an announcement, or previously there was an announcement about certain chemical companies connecting with the initiative to harmonize standards, right? Which we like. I think we like harmonization, right? Linda's shaking her head because she's in general, as a general thought.
As long as it's not lowest common denominator harmonization.
Okay. So let's get into it. What do we think about this initiative? ZDHC.
It was a slow starter because they were asked to do the impossible. So Greenpeace got the right subject. Effluent from dye houses needed dealing with. Their tactics were slightly wrong. They were insistent on zero, and as scientists, zero doesn't exist, and people were worried about how do we get to zero when we know we can't get to zero. So to promise to do the impossible was a problem. I think over the last few years, both Greenpeace and the industry have accepted that we should be working to tough but pragmatic standards and limits, and what ZDHC have got is a very, very sensible framework for controlling inputs, controlling outputs, and those tools work to a very large degree if implemented. But what you have got is, at the moment, you've still got it's up to the brands how much they implement it, and it's up to the brands how transparent they are with supply chains and where they implement it. Now, some brands are doing a really good job, some brands are doing a not so good job on transparency, and this is where we're at the stage where what's called the brand leadership program, where the brands are expected to be very clear with what they are doing, I hope that is a really, really rigorous scheme where people say, I know where 100% of my wet processes are, and they've been given the tools and they're meeting these standards. So the tools are there, the framework's there, and we're now at a stage where it's a question saying, can we get those tools implemented throughout supply chains? And it's over to the brands. Now, I'm slightly disappointed. I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I'm slightly disappointed that Greenpeace have taken a step back now, because...
Let's get into that in a second, because I'm actually very surprised that you're saying that too. Yeah, but the dark side, is yours darker than...
Yeah, so this might be the only place that Phil and I disagree, because
She turns to Phil with a smile, but I'm ready for the...
It's not personal. I don't have a good feeling about the ZDHC initiative. I've been quite outspoken about it, so this is not exactly headline news, although here we are on the podcast. But, I feel I've been dissatisfied with the list of chemicals that they have as their targeted list. Their MRSL is what I call the dead chemical list, with a lot of chemicals that have been out of commerce for a really long time. And I'm dissatisfied that they base everything on a safety data sheet, many of which are in poor quality and only tell you what are intentionally added ingredients at a certain concentration or higher. I think they miss a lot. And I've been frustrated that if anybody is going to spend a lot of time on this, it would be nice to get them focused on the right list and the right sources of information about whether those chemicals are on the list. And, they are an industry trade association. They don't have NGO participation, for example, on their board or anything like that. And I think they have been lowest common denominator. They have had a difficult time with that. They've had a hard time getting to agreement on a lot of things. I appreciate that that's a difficult situation, but I feel upset that there's been so much time focused on implementing a program that is not as buttoned down as it should be if people are going to spend that time and effort. And I know that they have a process in place to begin to improve their MRSL. Tick tock. Hopefully that will happen soon. I do agree with Phil that implementation is absolutely key. And that we have that problem, no matter what the quality of the program, we need brands to actually adopt this thing and, implement it. We need them to, for example, know where all their fabric is made so that they even know where to go. So I have full agreement of that, but I remain disappointed in the scope and the depth of ZDHC.
I may be able to, I don't want to put Linda's mind at rest, but offer some words of encouragement. I've been relatively recently been asked to be the chair of what's called the MRSL Advisory Council. So I am overseeing MRSL updates, and there is a clear, transparent process. So the first MRSL was created before I was involved in 2015.
And do you agree it's sort of a dead chemical list?
I'll come on to this, okay. but essentially the initial list married up with a lot of RSLs.
Mm-hmm, right.
So it married up, and MRSL is a manufacturing restricted substances list, which is chemical imports, and RSL is the restricted substances list, which is the chemicals you don't want on your shirt or your trousers or your shoes. So the first list married up with most of those. There is now a process in place, an open, transparent process, whereby anybody, any stakeholder can propose a chemical for addition to the MRSL, Linda included, and anything will be considered, and there's got to be evidence there to say why it should be restricted, evidence that it is actually used rather than a redundant chemical. And that process is now live. But in the interim, trying to align a lot of brand MRSLs with the ZDHC MRSL. We've looked at a huge list of chemicals, and we will be adding further chemicals to the list in the next few weeks. But also on that list is what I lovingly refer to as a dinosaur list, because we recognise a lot of the chemicals have not been used for a very long time. However, what we don't want them to do is be brought back from extinction.
Right.
So they will still be. They will still
That's
be.
That's good. Right. We don't want to get them off the list. Right.
They'll still be on the list. But my intention of chair of that group is to have a live list of relevant chemicals, and also make sure that evolves to meet the challenges. And just again, to put your mind at rest, the first list was created by the ZDHC team with the chemical industry, and it did a good job in matching the RSLs. The team that I manage includes people from academia, people from laboratory groups, people from NGOs, so ChemSec is involved, the chemical industry representatives, TGAWA, ETAD, and each sector gets a vote. So we have discussions. Most things are solved very clearly based on evidence, but if there is a sticking point, we will have a vote, and we also have what's called a candidate list, which will signal our intention to restrict things in future.
Okay.
So rather than restrict them tomorrow, we say we will restrict them in 2 years' time, rather like sensible legislation like the EU. So it's moving forward, Linda. That's all I would say.
Right. So good that you're both in the same room to discuss this.
In 2 years from now, I hope you have us back, and we'll see how it looks.
Yeah, we'll see.
So it's 2 years of practical timeline.
I don't know. We'll see.
What would be a good timeline? So
by 2020, that was the original.
2020. Okay.
End
That's
of.
next year.
I'll give you 20.
I didn't. 2020 wasn't my invention.
So let's wrap up by just discussing again some of these drivers. So we have a process. It sounds like, at least in your group, there are NGOs, there are academia, at least in principle, going to be participating. So that may allay some of your concerns, Linda. I'm thinking about, though, we talked about in the very beginning legislation. We know how hard that is. Then we talked about watchdogs. And now we're back to your comment about Greenpeace. My understanding is that Greenpeace is quote unquote taking a break from pressuring the textile industry on chemicals. For whatever reason, if they have other priorities in the environmental space, if they find that it's not profitable, no, that's not the word, if it's not generating enough resources for them to continue the campaign. But from an outsider's point of view, their role in driving this seemed pretty critical.
Yeah.
Without their campaign, whether or not it was overzealous or not always based in fact, which I don't know is the case, without them, this wouldn't have happened, I'm guessing. Do you agree, and what do you think about the implications of them pulling back from this?
I was very disappointed that they pulled back. I felt like they weren't done. And I'm not sure exactly the reasons that they decided to pull back, but I was disappointed in that. And I guess, it's almost like a little experiment. We can see whether the momentum in the industry continues because people are actually committed to this, or whether they were doing it in response to pressure. And I've worked for NGOs for a long time. There's a lot of possible reasons why they pulled back that are valid. And sometimes it's even just staffing changes. They had a chemist, now they don't have a chemist. It could be really, it sounds like sometimes small reasons that these decisions are made. But I, for one, was really disappointed. I thought that, although I agree with Phil that the zero was probably the wrong goal in the outset, I thought it was an effective campaign and that they're clearly not done. And so I was disappointed that they made that
And Phil, you have turned a corner on your view of Greenpeace.
Greenpeace changed from zero as a realistic aim to tough but pragmatic standards, and that was a game changer. And when you start trying to work with achievable standards, and you can change those standards to make them more aspirational and more challenging, that's the way to do it, rather than saying putting a gun to somebody's head and saying you must achieve the impossible. And so therefore they've become more pragmatic, and they do apply some sensible pressure, and they do have some sensible ideas. And one thing that I'm disappointed about is I would like somebody to be having independent oversight of how brands are actually implementing this. Now, what I would say is I thought their catwalk of shame that they did as part of their program was terrible. It was embarrassing. But basically that was based on if people answered the phone or emails. And you'd got some excellent brands that were described as laggards, and everybody knew they were the best companies managing chemicals. So it became, they lost credibility. However, they've got enough credit in the bank, I think, to come back and say, look, this is how we're measuring people, not by whether they respond to us and whether they bow to our demands, but they've got full transparency, they've got this data, and to be able to monitor how people work. And one thing I would say though, is that their departing shot is a document about how they are cleaning up or how they're going to buy their own merchandise in future. Because at the time when they launched this, they got caught with chemical nasties on their products, which is a bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
But what they have left the industry with, it is a blueprint of how to buy. It is magnificent.
That's good to know. I haven't seen it.
But what it is that most brands buy and then check. So they place an order and then they send their compliance teams in to check if the factory's all right, if the conditions are okay. A lot of brands just buy and don't check. The way to do it is check, then buy. So what they've got is a simple process where they say, we check the factories, and if they meet these requirements, you can argue whether the requirements are too stringent or whatever, but fundamentally, check, then buy. They will only place orders when the wet processes have been ticked off as being okay. Now, if we could embed that in the ways of working of the fashion industry, the world will be a much better place. Because what buyers don't necessarily understand is there is no better way to approve bad practice than to place an order.
Right.
It is a great way of approving bad practice. So when you as a company say, okay, we've placed this order, now compliance team, you go in and check this out. The compliance team go in and you've placed the order, you've just approved everything. You just approved my non-functioning effluent treatment plant. You just approved my dangerous machines. You've just approved my workers in flip-flops. So what are you doing now coming in to tell me what to do? Because you've just approved it. Whereas if you check and buy, and that, what Greenpeace has left us with is a template of how to buy merchandise is fantastic.
So I want to end with a potential crass comment, but maybe to hear back from you about, do I understand the theory of change right? For brands to drive this issue, if they're not legislated to do it, they're doing it why? Because they get some sort of reputational risk associated with it, right? So unless brands, and we're talking about brands within the countries that they're polluting, outside who are sourcing, unless someone's lifting up and shaming them or giving them some sort of pressure, the motivation seems to be limited, in my opinion, right? I'm seeing you shaking your head.
I agree.
You agree. And so if we're thinking about, those who are driving the issue, and I'm looking at you two, you're based in the United States, you're based in the UK, right? So we're not actually based often in the places where the big problems we're arguing need to be addressed are. If people are not directly harmed by harmful chemicals in the markets that we're from, somehow the only way it seems that we're going to be able to have those who are based mainly in those markets drive change is if their reputation is at risk. Otherwise, we're going to be relying on, of course, those governments and companies in those countries where it's polluted to say we can't stand for this either, right? So do you agree with that assessment as I've just described it?
Yeah, I think what I would like to see at some stage is for brand CEOs, not the head of compliance, not the head of sustainability, the CEOs to say, we will never place an order without knowing where the wet processing is done.
Right.
That would be the first stage. And then it would be, we will never place an order without knowing where the wet processing is done. And we've got absolute confirmation that it meets this standard.
Right. I guess my point is this. Even if greenhouse gases are hard enough to get people to feel about, they're feeling about them because they're global, right? So you're going to be affected, not just people somewhere else. Water, regional. Chemicals, regional with some maybe impacts right? So it feels like there's just, it's a weak argument for companies to do this beyond a moral obligation, or unless they're being watched.
Well, one thing that overlooks is China and the market in China. So the Chinese people really care about this. They care about this viscerally because it's in their daily life. And they are a huge market because, as you know, there's more than 1 billion of them, and they're all entering into not all, but many are entering into the middle class. And so when you think about a brand and a brand reputation and its market, you can't just think of the Western world. I agree with what you've said in terms of Western consumers, but they have other consumers, and their markets are
Future
rapidly
consumers.
growing.
Yeah.
So I think that we do have that going for us. And again, there modern tools of transparency and accountability that may very well catch up with these brands.
Phil, Linda, thank you very much. We have some watching the Phil to do, don't we? In the next 2
I have
years.
confidence.
Oh, no. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Pleasure.
thanks.
Thank you.